So, I think here the theme from the organizers was celebrate Indian cities because we were having an Indian evening, but also because cities have become very important. And I just want to sort of pick up really and share with you some recent research to see what we can learn from Indian cities. And I think a lot of debate today that occurred in some of the discussions in the roundtables was what is territorial, what is the urban-rural, how do you make these differences? So I just want to share with you at least what I'm thinking and what might actually help raise some questions in terms of what we can learn from India. So if you look at India, and you make a diagram of India the way we understand it, like you do for many other countries around the world, what you really see is this diagram, which is 7 mega cities, about 28 tier 2 cities. And among all of us here, and among even Indian students, when I have 20 or 40 or 100 of them, we never go beyond those 35 cities, because these are cities that are not on your radar. Actually, there are about 400 cities that in about 20 years are going to become 1 million people, and we don't even discuss it. Which means 400 million Indians are going to live in places that we don't even have on our radar as academics or even practitioners. But I think what is more interesting is how, if you start nuancing what you see here, what you really see in India. So what really is urban becomes an incredible question in India. So today when we were discussing, I think Alejandro was asking, where does the city stop, what is rural, what is urban? I think India opens up a whole different question because I think the whole urban is being defined quite differently. And I think the operative thing here is flux, because I think today also what the Biennale was raising as questions with social media, with new technologies, with infrastructure, how you leverage things. I think the big challenge for architects and planners in the coming decades is going to be how we define and design for flux, and how does a notion of flux inform the way we can make our imagination about cities. So in India, what is very interesting, and this is very new research that we are doing at the university with census data, which is the 2011 census data. And if you break down the 2011 census data in India, what you discover is to qualify as an urban area, the Indian government has 3 criteria. One criteria is that that places have to have a minimum population of 5,000 people. The second criteria is that the population density should be 400 people per square kilometer. The metropolitan area of Houston, which is going through these horrible floods because of its low density, is only 200 people per square kilometers, and it's yet a metropolitan and an urban area. India needs 400 people per square kilometer to define it as a city or a town, and at least 75% of the population of that settlement, the male population, this is weird, the male population has to be non-agricultural occupation. Now, how you can define non-agricultural occupation is a whole different story. So unless a city meets these 3 requirements, it doesn't become a town, which means it cannot have a municipality, which means it doesn't get funding, and it's run like a village. And that is absolutely incredible. So if you look at these 3 criteria, you begin to start getting a map, which is the one that you see on your left, and you start seeing these kinds of cities that are accumulated in these red circles, which is the business as usual way of representing the urban in a sense. Now, if you use these 3 criteria like the government does, in India we have about 7,500 towns which qualify to become towns, become census towns, and they actually get funding, they have a municipality. But if you use just the criteria of 5,000 people in that settlement, in India we have 32,000 towns, which means there are 27,000 towns which are not even being considered as settlements, which are totally off our radar. This is an amazing time bomb that we are sitting on, and that's what the other map shows you there. You get a completely different kind of texture to urbanization. Okay, so these are just the 3 criteria. I want to go through this again with you because this is important. A population of 5,000, density of 400 people, and 75% of the male population in non-agricultural occupation. So if you use only one criteria, which is 5,000 people, which is reasonable, that becomes urban India. And it's about 47% of India is urban if you use that. If you use the criteria of the density of 400 people per square kilometer, that is the urban India, which means all the way from Kashmir down to Calcutta through the Gangetic Plain, 200 kilometers wide, is the world's biggest megacity. It is a continuous megacity. And that's completely mind-boggling because you have otherwise urbanization just in South India and along the coast. So our investments are not in synchrony with the actual patterns of urbanization. And this is really frightening because this involves about 500-600 million people, which is not any small number. If you use the criteria of 75% of male population in non-agricultural occupation, that is urban India. What you see in red is urban India. So what is otherwise the world's largest megacity doesn't even register as a town because of that criteria. So this is, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that I think one is in the condition of India, this is very flawed because these two criteria give you a completely different map of urbanization. And our investments are being made on a third basis, which has nothing to do with the reality of where these densities occur. But this also raises many other questions. It starts raising the question, and this is a mapping we are doing looking at cropping seasons and the railway lines, and you're beginning to actually with new technologies predict how this movement will occur. Which means the thesis that we are building, which is remarkable, is that India is 60% urban for 6 months of the year and 40% urban for the other 6 months of the year, which means you have a flux of about 300 million people that go back and forth in probably some predictable pattern. So therefore the question of flux I think becomes really very important, and these are different migration systems depending on different cropping seasons if you look at wheat producing, rice producing, etc. Now I'm just giving you an example of the consequences. This is a settlement of 65,000 people called, it's in Rajasthan, but it does not meet the three criteria. So it's run like a village. It's treated like a village in terms of investment because this sort of flawed notion of what is urban. Consequently, you have a village here which with massive neoliberal investments is now run by the corporation because the village doesn't have the capacity to govern. So and these are just two examples. So in India, what's happening is a massive disjuncture because of the definition of what is urban in terms of how things are being governed. And because of this flux, we are not going to be able to deal with looking at our cities conventionally as we've done through architecture and urban design and urban planning in the business as usual way. And so these are towns which are considered to be villages just because they don't meet the criteria. And there are 27,000 settlements like this, which amount to about 400 to 600 million people that don't have the amenities of sanitation, water supply, or even governance, which would ensure public health, education, and planning. And so I think, we have a smart cities program now, but the disjuncture between the imagination of the government in terms of where the investment should go, which is massive amounts of investment, which the smart cities program in India has brought the urban to the center, but is completely based on an imagination that is not going to yield results. So therefore, I just come to this sort of more abstract notion of flux, and I think for us as designers, I think we've got to deal with this. The city is no longer about the static city, which is where architecture and urban design become instrumental in imagining a state of stability, which is how we sort of have learned to operate. So the static city, which is where architecture is the central spectacle and the central instrument to organize the built environment, is no longer a valid way of approaching this. And these are the new imaginations in India for many of these settlements. That is Amravati, which is the new capital for Andhra Pradesh, and it's designed by a Singapore firm using completely the static city as the sort of organizing instrument. So, I mean, that is really the texture of the city, where you have the static and what I'm calling the kinetic city, the dynamic city, the auto-constructed environments, which is 60% of settlements in India, all colliding in the same space, where architecture is totally important in terms of organizing this sort of space. Can we have the next one, please? And so with global flows, these disjunctures actually become accelerated. Can we have the next? So I borrow of Joan Busquet, who's a colleague of mine. This is a wonderful diagram he sort of developed, where he talks about the traditional city, which was about urbanization, plot division, and then buildings. The garden city development is when urbanization and plot division collapsed, and then you had building. Housing estates, which is what developers do as gated communities, and a lot of our environment is being built like this. Urbanization, plot division, and building collapse into becoming one entity, and it's something that is delivered. But in reality, in a country like India and many parts of the world in the global south, actually you have building, then plot division, and then urbanization. So it's a complete reversal of all the paradigms of urbanization that we have known. So the proposition more theoretically is that I think where, as architects, and I think the Biennale begins to raise these questions, and perhaps we have to push it a little more because the temporal dimension as a notion came up in a lot of the discussion, is we as architects and designers have to actually imagine transitions. I think our training and our pedagogy forces us into thinking about absolutes, which is where architecture actually becomes instrumental in a sense. But it is the design of transitions which is complex, and that's where really the temporal dimension enters. And the temporal dimensions with the new technologies that we have becomes, I think, a really potent question that we can ask ourselves to address some of these questions in terms of flux. So how do you imagine these transitions? Can we have the next? So I'm just using one example. So one example is energy. And I can just use India's example, and I'm sure these transitions many societies deal with. So in India, we are trying to make a jump from fossil fuels to renewables. We can't make that jump because our economy will collapse. And that's why with George Bush, India went into a nuclear agreement, because we are using nuclear energy to make the transition to renewables. Because if we go from fossil to renewables, our economy will completely collapse. So transitions sometimes take you in different directions if your goal can be the same and if politically you can get it there. We might get stuck in nuclear and it will be a disaster perhaps, just with all the problems of safety that go with it, which might also change. So transitions is something that we have to deliberately imagine. So in the built environment, how do we imagine these transitions? Because we are only thinking in terms of absolute solutions. And I think this becomes a very critical question for us to interrogate. So sanitation is the other big one. And I use this example, it's a very simple example just to illustrate what I mean, which is in Mumbai, we have one toilet for 1,440 people. It's completely mind-boggling that the city even operates like that. Now, the Bombay Municipal Corporation's target is one toilet for 150, or the municipality says that's the thing. Their target is one toilet for 50 people, which means 6 families would share one toilet. So you'd have to have a lottery every morning, and you were lucky, maybe once in a week you could use the toilet. It's ridiculous that we even have a target like that. It's actually shocking. But this is a huge problem. Now, our Prime Minister, I think, has identified this problem in real terms. And he has made his promise that by 2020, he's going to have a toilet for every Indian. And that's really interesting. And if you look at that map there, and what you see in dark brown, which is the appropriate color, India has the largest amount of open defecation in the world. Even Africa, which you would think because of poverty would be higher. Maybe they have more land and I don't know what happens, but India has an absolutely incredible problem in this regard. And that's why having a toilet for every family is an amazing target that the government has set. But what they do is, and this is how, today the state uses statistical architecture of GDP. Architecture is not used any longer to represent state identity. The private sector uses it. And so the government is now boasting that we've provided millions of toilets, because what they do is they make single toilets in big factories, and then they go and dump it outside people's homes in the villages, because they can't deal with the slums. Imagine trying to get a toilet for everyone in slums like that with that high density. You keep Burdett talked about the densities in Mumbai. So to do one toilet is an absolute solution because it doesn't work. So now studies are showing that nobody uses these toilets. These toilets in the villages are the most solid structure. So people use it to store their jewelry, to store wheat and rice, because it's the only solid concrete structure that's in the village for everybody's house. So it's an absolutely wrong solution to be looking at as an absolute solution because it doesn't culturally fit into the settlement pattern, so to speak. So therefore the transition here has to be through community toilets. Can we have the next slide? It has to be through community toilets, and this is a badly designed community toilets, but this is what I mean by transition. So for us to think that we can solve the problem of sanitation by providing a toilet to everyone is completely looking in the wrong direction. So we have to make a transition over 20 years to change these cultures so that you can then, by then, also begin to rejig these settlements, that you can actually bring a personal toilet or sanitation into this without demolishing it. Of course, this is the limitation of a democracy, but also the celebration of a democracy, because if it wasn't a democracy, then we could actually erase those settlements and start from scratch. But in a democracy, you can't do that. You have to work within that constraint. So public toilets then become, now the question is, how do you make reversible community toilets where you might reverse them? So there are toilets that have a life cycle of 20 years, 15 years, depending on the projections we make in our speculations of this temporal landscape. So this is a kind of design we were speculating on, which is solar panels. It gets it off the grid. It's a hybrid solution. It has a community center on the top where women and children can actually do night classes. The men and women are separated. Flowers are used as a filter. So we were trying to look at different imaginations of how you can make this transition. But my point is only this, that in every type that we are thinking of, if we think of absolute solutions, when we have such large flux in our cities, it's completely the wrong direction in terms of investments to go in. We were trying to see, this was a Gates Foundation competition which we won, where we were trying to see how you could even embed it much more in the community, where it disappears, it becomes shops for sanitation, for purified water. The toilet then becomes incidental. So they become places that can become community centers as they transition into another pattern. And maybe the idealism is that if it can sit across from the temple. So I think in this kind of landscape of flux, for me, at least this is a personal interest that is now developing, is how do you then look at ephemeral landscapes? Because if flux means that you don't lock yourself into permanent solutions, then the question becomes that as a profession and as practitioners, has permanence become too much of an assumption that we are founded on in our imaginations of the built environment? And this, I think, we need to challenge in some ways. So my new research looks at the ephemeral and looks at the intelligence of the city and the city of Mumbai in trying to find ways that it operates that might help us tide over these solutions. So I call it the kinetic city as being a more productive category, I believe, than the formal and the informal. Because when we set up the formal and the informal, we by default set up a binary. And binaries are never productive for design because design is about synthesis. And so I think constructing the jargon that might help us bring to bear design imaginations is also very, very important. And so I don't like to use the word informal for that reason, unless it has to do with economic metrics. And the kinetic for me is more productive in my own imagination, or the ephemeral in imagining what this flux might be. This is Mumbai. Can we have the next one? And this has been talked about by Ricky Burdett. It's 12 to 15, and it's going to be about 29 million. It's going to be projected to 30, and it's going to be about flux, because this movement back and forth between the urban and the rural is going to become a complete blur. So smart cities will not be about the physical structure of smart cities. Yes, we can use technology. Smart cities will be about smart agents that can transform the imagination of the urban. And this means people, ordinary people, using these technologies and using flux to their advantage, both in terms of leveraging their own livelihoods, but also adapting to these settlements. And that's the present form of the city as we know it in this condition of flux. So I just give you this example. This is Manhattan and Mumbai. It's at the same scale, so you can see the green space. In Manhattan, at least Central Park is one centralized piece. In Mumbai, it's fractured and fragmented. Can we have the next? And I mean, this is in scale 2, and you see Mumbai here. That's the amount of space compared to New York, green space. Even Delhi has much more green space. And in Mumbai, that dot includes the traffic circles where they plant some trees. So it's kind of a desperate representation. Even Tokyo, that you would think is much more dense, is much larger in terms of green space proportion to Mumbai. Can we have the next one? And so as a result of that, you have open spaces used in very innovative ways. This is the Maidans, the large open spaces in Mumbai. Go on. They're used for cricket, this wonderful Indian game that the British invented, which is like a religion. So cricket is something everyone plays. These are sacred sort of lands. But in the evening, it becomes a venue for weddings, just in the 24-hour cycle. The cricket pitch nobody touches because that's sacred. This is the club members having tea. That's the wedding that's wrapped around. This is the kitchen that serves both of them. And next one. And by the morning, it disappears. It's put up in bamboo and cloth, and it's responding to this flux in a sense. And this is not the city of the poor. This is the richest people in the city using it. It's a particular condition of density. It's a particular condition of culture and climate. So it's also a city that grows incrementally, and I call this the 5 stages of squatting. The guy in this image is in the 3rd stage. Over 1 year, everyone gets used to them, and they become part of the paraphernalia. The whole city grows like this incrementally. And it has a whole logic to it. It has to do with safety, security, how much you've bribed your way into the system. So there is a complex logic behind it. Corporations have understood this. Procter & Gamble invented the sachet, which is if you sold the poor 1 bottle of shampoo, they couldn't afford it because it was their month's salary. So they sold it in little increments so that they could afford it on a daily basis. And Procter & Gamble made millions here, and this is called the bottom of the pyramid because that's where the biggest markets exist. And the corporations have understood it. Can we have the next one? And of course, in economy, it's all linked. It's bribes per day that go into the formal economy, come out of the informal economy. It's a blur. It's a kind of kinetic space, metaphorically. Can we have the next one? For example, McDonald's, when they set up 12 years ago in India, they realized that no one can have a drive-in McDonald's, so they did home delivery. So they broke the market by doing home delivery, which is now common everywhere in the world. But they kind of invented it 15 years ago to break this sort of idea where McDonald's had to get to people. Here, architecture is not even the spectacle of the city. These festivals become the spectacle of the city. So it's also an enacted process. It's a temporary moment. Architecture is not used to encode the memory of the city. And so this ordinary street in Mumbai, for this festival, for 10 days, gets transformed into a community center. And it becomes a community hall. It gets taken over. There's dance, there's music, there's food, exactly like everything that happened today. Can we have the next one? And after 10 days, it disappears, and it leaves no memory. And of course, this is a massive festival. It involves 6 or 7 million people. In Calcutta, it's Durga Puja. And millions of people, Ricky also showed this slide, come and immerse this god on the last day. So the whole process is an enacted process. There is no way to encode the memory of the city in this spectacle. And as this clay idol dissolves in the water, the memory of the city sort of dissolves because it is an enacted process and it gets repeated. It's kind of an ephemeral happening. But this is the major spectacle by which people memorize the city and even represent it. And so this idea that you have the formality of the static city and the informality of the life that occupies it needs much more recognition. And of course, in housing, it's much more complicated. I don't have the time to go into this, but it's a much more complex thing because it involves people living and occupying space. But the fluxes also exist, sometimes in brutal ways of demolition, and sometimes in brutal ways of auto-construction without the sanitation, etc. Can we have the next? And then again, the economy blurs here in some ways, the formal and the informal. So this is a house where the investment is not in the settlement because there's no tenure, but people are investing in the white goods. So you have everything. You have laptops, you have televisions, air conditioners, refrigerators, but you don't have the investment in the unit of the house. Can we have the next? And of course, the network city, something that's celebrated here in many ways, becomes a solution in ways of creating forms of access. But again, there's not enough time to go into this, but I just wanted to flag that out in the context of the Biennale. Can we have the next? And so it's in this context that what we tried to do here on Alejandro and Pei's sort of request was to celebrate one aspect of what I'm calling the kinetic city, and this is the dabbawalas, because what we have is a railway system that's incredibly efficient, a formal piece of infrastructure which slices through the city in totally amazing ways, creating mind-boggling imagery as it goes along. And so within this system is this community of 5,000 people, which will be by tomorrow, I hope, represented in those 2 rooms there. They're called the Dabbawalas, and it's an amazing service. It's a community of 5,000 people. It's an informal economy, but it leverages a formal piece of infrastructure, in this case, Mumbai's railway system, to expand and make elastic the urban condition in terms of what it sort of gives back to the city. And so it uses strategically the rail lines which allow it to use this mobility infrastructure to distribute these lunch boxes. And so it's a very efficient railway system which makes it possible. So that just shows you the kind of distribution, the multimodal, some cycles, how it finds its way as relays to the train system that brings the lunches then to the different central business districts. So basically, the service is, it costs about $6 to $7. It costs from $5 to $7 depending on where you're located. These guys are 3,500 to 5,000 people who form this service. They deliver 200,000 lunch boxes every day. They pick it up at your house, wherever your house is in the city. They deliver it to your desk at your office, and in 1 hour after that, they pick it up and they take it home. They have a 1 in a million error. People find it so safe that they sometimes, if somebody's forgotten a watch at home, the wife or the mother will send it in the box because they know it will be safe. It's a kind of foolproof system. That is, for me, very interesting because it's a mapping of the formal and informal to create this blur, to create this kinetic space that I'm speaking about. Because when we start posing the binary of the formal and the informal, for us as designers, it's non-productive. We cannot bring our imagination to see what the possibilities in the city would be. And so this becomes an example, I think, to provoke us in a positive way to think about other such possibilities where monofunctional infrastructure can be leveraged by other softer forms of intervention, whether it's technology, whether it's social media, to extend the efficiency of the city in productive ways. And so I'll just run you through how this system works. So they pick up the food, somebody has cooked the food at home, people live in joint family systems. Indians love their food, they love it hot. There are many religious sort of restrictions on what you can eat and what you can't eat. So for many reasons it's very successful. Can we have the next? They pick it up at your house on these cycles. They mark it. These are codes which again in the exhibition tell you what it stands for. They're all marked up in which building, which sector it goes to. They cycle in small relays. They make groupings of 200 boxes among 4 or 5 people that feed it to a central system. Then they accumulate it on these trays, which again you'll see in the exhibition, and they load it onto the trains. And then they have these areas they reserve in the train where they can carry many of these. Then they unpack them at the other end and they shift it by zones. And then they take it down to the downtown offices where they go and deliver it. Then they break up into small groups to deliver it, and they get to the different offices. They sort it out, this guy's in the elevator, and they deliver it on your table. Now there are many interesting things about this. One is it gives you a hot meal at your table. This is a kind of boss guy, so he's eating alone. People, and many anthropologists have studied this. One especially, Susan Katzenstein. One of the interesting observations for me was that in work cultures and corporate cultures like cities of Mumbai, like New York, where ethnic identities actually dissolve in the way you dress, and in the etiquette that you display at a place of work. But when you have lunch in the office with all your colleagues, your ethnic identity gets reinforced, because by seeing the food, people can tell somebody is vegetarian, non-vegetarian, they're Jain, they don't have garlic and onions because their religion restricts them from having it. If you're from South India or North India, your ethnic identities get reinforced just by the display of the food that gets spread out, in a sense, on these tables. So that's one fallout of this. And I'm just putting this up because, I think they're going to show the film at some point called Tiffin Box, which is or Lunch Box, sorry, which is an interesting film. And this system, I'm romanticizing it in some way and provoking us as planners to think about the value embedded in looking at the blur between the formal and the informal, between an informal occupation leveraging formal infrastructure. And I think that is really inspiring for us to look at cities today in ways we use monofunctional infrastructure which rips fabrics across the city and sometimes is not even productive. But it's also considered to be a model business practice in the way of logistics, etc. And Harvard Business School actually has a case study on it, and they studied it in great detail. And this film, Lunchbox, is interesting because it actually, through the narrative of a lunchbox going to the wrong person, which is a 1 in a million error according to the Harvard Business School, opens up very complex relationships between people who never meet each other. But it also creates complex relationships between people who live in the same building. And there's a wonderful scene there where this lunchman comes to this woman and she says that, you're delivering my lunchbox to somebody else because I'm getting a note from them saying this is a wrong lunchbox. And this guy who is illiterate, and he's there in his very traditional clothes, picking up the box, tells this woman in the film, it's a lovely line, and he says that's impossible because even the Harvard Business School has said that we don't make an error. So he uses that to legitimize their own operation. And it's a very nice moment in the film, a very touching moment in the film. And so so not only is this, I think, inspiring for us as practitioners in cities, but it's also from the perspective of logistics seen as model practice. So the kinetic city, as I'm talking to you about this, and the notion of flux, is a place of elasticity. It's about incrementalism. I think Ricky Burdett spoke about London being the incremental city. Mumbai, at another scale, in terms of its economy, in terms of a different kind of fabric that it constructs, is also an incremental city. And our histories go back to the British, because the British always practiced incrementalism, even historically, in the growth of Mumbai, which means they didn't lock solutions into absolutes, is what I was saying. In fact, when I look at the history of Bombay, because of its history of reclamation, because the British weren't sure for a very long time that Mumbai was, it was supposed to be anything greater than a port for outlets of goods. It was never expected to become a big town. And so the DNA of a place like Mumbai, like many port towns in the world, which were ports of colonial extraction, were incremental because they were not being locked into absolute solutions. Unlike Delhi, for example, which had a master plan, which was intended as a large capital, and it was an absolute solution to create a city as a capital for the empire. But Mumbai and many other colonial port cities were about these transitions, about anticipating what might be needed in the next 10 or 20 years in a short-term view of history, not in a long-term view like 300-400 years in the case of Delhi. So incrementalism, I think, as a notion, for me, becomes much more relevant in the world today, where we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. We are dealing with flux, as I've shown you with the statistics of at least urbanization in India, but we are dealing with flux even in terms of climate change. We are not able to even anticipate where these big disasters are coming, whether it's geopolitical reconfiguring. Look at the refugee problem. Again, Ricky said no one in Europe expected a few million people would show up. Now these solutions will not come with the absolute mode of urban planning. They will come with incrementalism. They will come with imagining new forms of transitions into newer kinds of formations of our city and our urban areas. The kinetic city is also about appropriation, how you can appropriate space in the way we are appropriating the space for a lecture right now. And this appropriation, reappropriation, deappropriation, looking at the ephemeral, as places of happening, the spectacles, being a range of spectacles in the representation of cities, opens up many other possibilities for us to make much gentler transitions than looking at absolute solutions in trying to solve problems that we can't even predict where they'll go in the next few years. And lastly, I think it's about soft thresholds. It's about making transgressions, whether they're between different communities in a city, whether it's between different ethnicities, whether it's different economic groups, whether it's different uses. The fact that things can recede, appropriate, become something else, and have the ability to accommodate these different forms of flux, I think it's very critical. So just to loop back to where I started to end this, I think in the context of the Biennale, my response is really to some of the questions that were discussed about what are the boundaries of the urban-rural that Alejandro kept raising, and I think looking at the example of India, what we can learn from India is we're seeing an extreme form of flux, which in the case of China is different because China did instrumentally use cities as static objects to at least attempt to stabilize what this might do, but I'm not sure yet. One can't predict that they're successful. Looking at Sarah's installation, one sees many abandoned places. And so India and China, with these billion people, I think what India is showing us is that we need to take as planners and architects the notion of flux very seriously. I think the challenge for us going into the future is really designing for transitions, which I think is a completely different approach to design. And I think in the process what we have to challenge is absolute solutions and the notion that permanence should not be considered a default condition in the world today. Thank you very much.